Hey, what's up, guys? This is a continuation of chapter 29b. So, as Americans were disillusioned by LBJ lying to them about the Vietnam War, Nixon lying about Watergate, and Gerald Ford granting a full pardon to Richard Nixon despite his pretty much guilty verdict, they wanted a new president. They wanted a new identity, and they got it in President Jimmy Carter. So he was a Democrat, unlike Nixon, who was a Republican. He served from 1976 to 1978, but he had a pretty difficult presidency. Right off the top, he had to face a public fight with prominent women advocates. They didn't necessarily see eye to eye in terms of what was the proper role of women and women's rights. He was unable to reignite the economy. Remember, the 1970s was a time of stagnated economy. Yes, he stimulated competition and cut prices, but companies began to close and unions also lost power, and other companies started to go overseas as well. Right before he ends his presidency in 1979, we have the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian crisis, where American citizens are captured by Iranians and are held hostage for over a year. And Jimmy Carter, for the most part, doesn't get the recognition that maybe he should in terms of trying to liberate these Iranian hostages, but his presidency was affected by that. So we continue to have major issues in the United States. In 1970, we have a new affirmative action. So this is a policy to help people who had been discriminated, especially in jobs and in education, particularly minorities. So affirmative action made it so that government could start making it more equitable for minorities and women to have an even status in society. So one way that they did it was the government started to recruit minorities and women for government jobs. Jobs and education institutions were, they needed to set aside a certain numbers of slots for women and minorities so that they could be incorporated into the mainstream of America. Now, we do have a major case right off the top with affirmative action. Bake versus University of California in 1978. Alan Bake, he was a white student who had been rejected from UC Berkeley Medical School, I believe a couple of times. And part of it was because UC Berkeley had reserved 16% of its slots for minority students. Now, Bake argued that he had better grades and test scores than the minority students who were being admitted. So he called this reverse discrimination. He took his case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard the case, and they actually agree with Bake. They say that race cannot be the only reason why Bake was being kept out of UC Berkeley Medical School. So UC Berkeley Medical School was forced to accept him because he had the knowledge, the skills to be a pretty good medical student. Now, the eventual Supreme Court case, the biggest decision was that race could be used as one of the criteria for admitting students to provide a diverse campus, but that was only one of several other criterions that needed to be applied. Obviously, extracurricular activities could count, and GPA as well. So race was not the only method to try to eliminate people from joining enrolling in a school. And again, that was affirmative action. We still have it today. For some of you guys, it could work to your advantage. So make sure you understand it a little bit more. Let's go ahead and talk about women's rights. We're going to be talking about women's rights quite a bit, actually. So by the 1970s, the women's rights movement took off. Remember, in the 1960s, it kind of started its roots after the civil rights movement. By the 1970s, it was full speed ahead. So women started to lobby legislators. They wanted to call legislators for equal rights. They took to the streets and marched as well. They established all female collectives where poll stations, only females were able to vote. Established women's centers to come and get some form of aid or support, be that economic or emotional support. And they also helped women who were working by having all women run child care facilities. So if you were a female who was going out to work and didn't have a place to have your kids where they could be taken care of, these child care facilities did exactly that. Now, they also began to challenge policies of all male colleges. So for some colleges, they pretty much accepted mainly males or only males. And so women started to challenge that as well. And when they started getting into colleges, then they began offering women's studies in colleges as well. And women were also being hired to work as professors, faculty in colleges. So all of this encouraged women to become physicians as well, because one of the major arguments that the women wanted was control over their health, over their bodies. And so women started to found dozens of medical clinics for women's rights and women's support. Now, we have the major equal rights Amendment here. It was introduced in 1923. So 50 years later, the Equal Rights Amendment pretty much stated that equality should not be denied on the basis of sex, and women had been denied equality on the basis of sex in the job, in education, and another method. So 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment again is gaining momentum, and 34 of the 38 states had already approved it. And then it came to a screeching halt. And the major person usually accredited for stopping the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, is Phyllis Schlafly. So she was actually a female, and she was a lawyer. So she had been able to benefit from some of the women's rights organizations. She was a conservative, and she wanted to stop ERA. And this is her argument. She said that ERA would produce an unnatural unisex society, and that women were not going to be drafted to the armed forces. And as such, this was going to create an imbalance in society, and that was not fair for women. So through her efforts, ERA actually fell short of ratification. Again, only 4 states more needed to be to ratify ERA, and it would have taken effect. It would have become an amendment. So 34 out of 38 states approved it, and they never got the other four states to approve it. So we see that there is a women's rights movement going forward, but not all women agree with the methods that they are using to try to give women equal rights. So we see here a parade. One of the methods that the women did was take to the streets to try to fight for women's rights. This caption here, that is pretty much everything that ERA said. That equality of rights under the law should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's all it said. But we see again here, Phyllis Schlafly, she wanted to stop ERA because she did not agree with the methods and possibly the outcome of an amendment that was going to put women equal to men in certain cases, in certain ways. So that's part of the women's rights and the women's movement. And then finally, a major one was the women's health. Again, this was the primary reason why women were advocating for equality, the health movement. Roe versus Wade, Supreme Court case that, oh my goodness, is very, very influential and is very important. Hopefully you guys have heard about it, but if not, we'll learn a little bit more about it here. So by the 1960s, abortion was illegal practically in every state. Well, women began to challenge that because they felt that their body was being violated because they didn't have a right over whether they should abort or not. So eventually we have another Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade in 1973. The Supreme Court mentioned that abortion performed in the first trimester, meaning the first 3 months of a woman's pregnancy, was protected by the right to privacy. Women were able to do that, and nobody could say anything about it because it was their privacy to incorporate that. And that word, protected by the right to privacy, has been the challenge of other cases regarding abortion. And of course, abortion continues to be a hot debated topic. Well, but women, this Roe versus Wade was a huge accomplishment for the women's rights movement because now women had the right over their bodies to decide of whether they wanted to have an abortion or not. Remember, Medicaid did establish funds for poor people, and Medicaid was actually being used to perform abortions, but some taxpayers felt that their income taxes should not go to a practice that they don't necessarily agree with. So they pushed back, and in 1976, the Supreme Court agreed with them, and they denied Medicaid funds for abortion. So in essence, unless you had the money to pay for abortions, you couldn't get one. So it actually becomes also an economic problem if you were poor and you wanted to abort. Conservatives, we're going to see this time and time again, and this is why it's italicized. Conservatives, remember, they start to push back because of all the social unrest in the 1960s. So one of the ways that they push back here is in abortion. They pursue legislation to limit conditions for abortion. Not anybody who wanted to get an abortion was able to. And they also limit the number of abortion clinics available to women. And we're going to see time and time again that a lot of these movements were being pushed back by conservatives because they were tired of all the civil unrest that took place in the 1960s. So that was Roe versus Wade, part of the women's rights movement as well. And finally, we'll finish it off with the women's rights movement, but this case, we're going to include the family as a whole. This was a changing time for families. So because of stagnation, low wages, inflation, high unemployment, women's rights movement, counterculture, baby boomers, all of that affected the family life by the 1970s. In part because of the economy, women were forced to enter the labor force, and that helped their family survive. You see this chart here that shows you, we're going to be focusing on women between the ages of 25 and 54. So these three bars right here, the different colors represent the different years. So 1976, women between the ages of 25 and 34, about 50% of them were on the workforce. 10 years later, in 1986, about 65% of those women in that age bracket were on the workforce. By 1994, we are reaching about 80%. So more and more women started to join the workforce, and that is very identical to the age group between 35 and 44. And again, we also see an increase between the age groups between 45 and 54. So more and more women were entering the labor force, again, in part to be able to provide for the family. Now, another thing that was happening is that divorce rates doubled from 1965 to 1985. So if you're a single mother trying to raise a child, you needed to get a job. And that also has an impact on family. Children born in the 1970s had a 40% chance of growing up in a single parent household. So that's all part of the reason why females started to join the workforce. Now, single mothers increased, but professions and skill jobs for women also increased. And a lot of that had to do because more and more women were getting a higher education. So there were more jobs that were open to them, and they took advantage of that. Now, even if women were married, some of them still were on the workforce, and their wages helped to keep up with the middle income family or just trying to survive. So their wages helped to buy a car, pay for colleges, afford medical bills, support an aging parent, pay rent, or pay for a mortgage. So we see again the impact of women. 1960s, 1970s, the women's rights movement, not only calling for rights, but also taking up a new role in terms of the family role here. We'll move on and talk about gay rights now as well. So the man that you see here is Harvey Milk. We'll talk about him in a minute. By the mid-1970s, gays and lesbians had gained some rights. Again, like women's movement, the gay rights started its roots in the 1960s. By the 1970s, also it was in full force. So part of the laws that they gained was employment and housing discrimination was prohibited if a person was gay or lesbian, so by their sexual orientation. So that was again a huge movement for gay rights, a huge accomplishment. And Harvey Milk, again, the guy that you see here, he becomes a symbol of gay political powers. He actually is from New York, moved to San Francisco, and he has his own photo shop, which is back here, Castro Photos. And he starts to see that more and more people who are gay and lesbians want more of their rights. And so he kind of becomes an advocate for them. Now, he was not a politician by trade. He was a salesman with a camera. So he starts to run for some political office in San Francisco. The first couple of times he is unsuccessful, but eventually in 1977 he wins the San Francisco Board of Supervisors seat, and he calls for gay rights, obviously. But that was not like any politician; they do not have just one agenda. Harvey Milk also wanted to improve other forms of society like transportation, housing, and also education for his children. He's able to push for gay rights ordinance in San Francisco. In 1978, unfortunately, a year after he is elected supervisor of the San Francisco city, he is assassinated, in part because him and the governor of San Francisco, George, I forget his last name, George Moscone, they actually start to bump heads with another individual, Dan White. Dan White actually had resigned from the police force, and Harvey White and the governor, George Moscone, had the opportunity to rescind that resignation, which they didn't because they didn't necessarily agree with Dan White. So Dan White, a disgruntled former employer, goes in, shoots the governor first, George Moscone, and then shoots also Harvey Milk, killing both of them. And unfortunately, Dan White was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and that also launches a lot of protests over the issues here. Again, conservatives, they do not necessarily like where this is going, so they start to advocate to slow down gay rights. And so we see that there is a conflict between liberals who want to push for women's rights, gay rights, abortion, and conservatives who felt like, okay, enough on social unrest, enough conflict, we need to take family back and civil rights back as well.